So today I want to talk about nationalism and libertarianism. And I have an article that I posted on X, and I'm going to also post it on Substack, and I'll put links below this video on nationalist, kind of ethno-nationalist politicians and parties versus libertarians. And I'm particularly focusing on incentives in politics in what we have today, which is mass democracy, modern mass democracy, because I was reading some libertarian literature on the effects of mass democracy as a political system on incentives and the growth of bureaucracy. And so I wrote an article on X, nationalism, libertarianism, and the perverted incentives of politicians in modern mass democracy. And so while populist movements can lead to libertarian results, as seen in Argentina with the election of Javier Milei and in the US with Elon Musk's Doge, many populists deeply resent and oppose libertarian policies, right? And the punchline here in this article is, let me just get to that, is this. The reality is that in modern mass democracy, to get elected, politicians have no choice but to buy the votes. They have to appeal to specific voting blocks and provide them with something. And my argument is that both in the case of nationalists and libertarians, the incentives are such that you can't really trust either of those, and there's various degrees of cynicism in both blocks. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to read something about the libertarian, the Austro-libertarian view of the incentives in mass democratic politics, and then to look at a video by Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad, from the founder of Lotus Eaters, and his discussion of the recent spat. Let me just go to that. The recent spat in the new Nigel Farage's Reform Party. And I kind of wanted to interpret what's going on in that situation from this kind of libertarian point of view, and this kind of the Austro-libertarian economic analysis of the economics of politics, the incentives in politics, and how this idea that either side, that there's like Carl Benjamin, he's saying, well, this guy, Rupert Lowe, he's being stabbed in the back by Nigel Farage. And Carl Benjamin says, well, Rupert Lowe did nothing wrong. It's Nigel Farage is playing the Messiah, and he's playing a power game. When in reality, when you look at incentives, they all do that. There's no such thing as a good politician. How do you know that a politician is lying? His mouth is moving, right? And so this idea that you can have politicians who are in the right, who have done nothing wrong, they're all in the political game. And the difference between politics and private enterprise is that private enterprise sorts things out. You don't have to be like, you don't have to depend on the entrepreneur to be an angel for them to provide you with value, if they don't provide consumers and customers with value, they'll be screened out by by market forces. In other words, we want entrepreneurs to be greedy, and greed will lead them to provide value within a free market system. In politics, on the other hand, you have to pray and hope that they're an angel, because they have to resist all the incentives and all the temptations of politics. So let's have a look at I want to look at what ChatGPT is telling us, or summarizing the Austro-libertarian economist position on incentives in politics. So let's have a read through that. Austro-libertarian economists analyze the incentives of the state, particularly democratically elected politicians and government bureaucrats, through a critical lens. So critical usually here connotes kind of a critical analysis, a kind of, you could call this a political economy. So that's similar to Marxism, right? But it's a kind of, it's the Austro-libertarian counterpart to Marxist political economy. So to continue, so they're analyzing them, emphasizing how state actors respond to institutional incentives that often lead to inefficiency, rent-seeking, and power accumulation. Right, so inefficiency, well, that's clear, like Elon Musk's Doge is revealing just how much inefficiency there is. Rent-seeking means that, and this is what I was addressing in my article, that politicians must appeal to constituencies, and so groups which can garner political power or political following want to approach politicians to seek advantages and benefits, right, in exchange for votes, and that's called rent-seeking. And power accumulation. So politicians are incentivized. The payoff for the politician is power, right? It's not the money, it's the power. It's the powerful friends, powerful allies, right? And that's why politicians are incentivized to engage in a lot of fairly illegal activity, because as long as that provides benefits to their rich friends, who will then protect them? You see, the politician needs to make rich friends, which will protect them after they've been elected out, voted out, right? And they've engaged in a lot of under-the-table corruption in one way or another, but that's okay because they will be protected by their powerful friends. You see, that's how that works. So power is really the currency of politics. So the state has a coercive monopoly. Unlike private firms, which operate under profit and loss incentives, the state is a coercive monopoly that funds itself through taxation rather than voluntary exchange. You see, when you look at how politicians justify what they do, they kind of pretend that it's like the free market. You vote, and so that's the process whereby you voluntarily choose. So when they do something and you don't like it, they say, well, you voted for this, right? You voluntarily chose this. Well, that's complete nonsense, right? Because most people, and this is what we're going to get to, most people just don't have the energy to really look into the policies and then to hold politicians accountable. The whole process is too complicated and cumbersome, unlike the voting with your money, where you vote immediately and then there are fairly clear mechanisms for punishing business people who do not provide value. In particular, if there is, in particular online now that you have these rate and review systems, they really hold vendors of products accountable, right? Because they get instant feedback. That doesn't exist in politics. So to continue, this lack of competition and voluntary accountability leads to inefficient and self-serving behavior among state actors. 2, incentives of democratically elected politicians. Politicians are primarily driven by the incentive to get elected and stay in power rather than serving the public good. Since voters are often rationally ignorant, which means they have little incentive to deeply study policies, politicians resort to short-term promises, populism, and redistribution schemes that buy votes but often harm long-term economic health. Deficit spending and inflationary policies are common because the costs are deferred to future generations, while the benefits, such as welfare programs or infrastructure projects, generate immediate electoral gains. Right. And what I was arguing in my article, well, this is obvious for the nationalists. The nationalists on the right, they have no problem maintaining the welfare state. What they won't tell their constituencies, right, that they're appealing to, is that the welfare state will lead to economic bankruptcy, right? So they're basically lying to the constituencies that somehow they will be economically better off if you get rid of all the immigration and just redirect resources to the natives. But even the libertarians are incentivized to promise some, backdoor welfare of one form or another. In particular, because until you get rid of central banking, the easy money provides welfare for vulture capitalists who are able to get cheap loans. So there's a double whammy, because there's a central banking, so easy money for people who can access it, right? So vulture capitalists, they have the background capital, right, to be able to get loans. And then if you don't get rid of open borders, right, mass immigration, which then brings cheap labor. So these people have access to cheap money and cheap labor, and this is basically welfare for the rich. So it's just more welfarism, and libertarians facilitated by eliminating prohibitions on construction and or buying up businesses and then exploiting them. It's you've got to kind of get into the legal situations, right? But generally, that's what incentivizes people who vote for libertarians. So in the US, you have the Cato Institute, and therefore they're basically promoting open borders policies and various deregulatory policies that facilitate vulture capitalism, buying up companies, and then offshoring manufacturing, right? So you have an American company, right? And then the vulture capitalist comes in and then offshores the manufacturing. So the company, it just becomes kind of a brand. It still makes the same stuff. It's just no longer made locally. It's these kinds of things that give libertarianism a bad name, because basically it's welfare for the rich. government bureaucrats and rent seeking. So bureaucrats have a little incentive to operate efficiently because the agencies do not face market competition. So I experienced this personally because in my 20s, I worked for the government. I got a job in the Department of Education. And it was torture because I had literally nothing to do. I went to work in this department, and I was basically sitting there for 8 hours with very little to do. I was doing some data entry, but most of the time I had nothing to do. They would give me make work. It was torture. And I asked my boss, why does my job exist? And he basically told me straight up, because it's in the budget. And if they eliminate it, they will lose that money. And this told me everything I need to ever know about how the government operates. 90% of government is make work. And they keep the whole thing going through these regulations. And I think the word regulation needs to be kind of abandoned, because a regulation within the Austro-libertarian economic point of view is really a prohibition. So a regulation that, let's say I like beer, I like drink beer, and the government tells me that I should like drinking beer, but I like beer anyway, so it doesn't make any difference. So if the regulation doesn't change anything from a practical point of view, it's meaningless. It's only if the regulation prohibits something, like this, I like beer, but the regulation tells me that I can't drink beer. It's a prohibition. That's the only time that it matters, right? Or let's say, a better example might be, let's say I'm a heterosexual man and I like women, and the regulation says I should only like women, and I'm like, okay. But if you're a homosexual man, and let's say the regulation doesn't say that you can't have intercourse with other men, that doesn't make a difference. But if it says you can only have intercourse with women, you can't have intercourse with other men, you see that it prohibits what you want to do. So a regulation only really matters when it prohibits something that you would otherwise want to do. Not the best examples, but you get the point, right? A regulation, it seems innocuous because it's just kind of saying, well, we are just making sure that people do the right thing. It's a prohibition. You see, when you say that it's a prohibition, then it's the more correct connotation, because the question is, right, do prohibitions work? And, it's a prohibition. So then you have to look at prohibitions like the prohibition of alcohol, right? It tends to change the incentives in various ways. And the question is, why are you prohibiting something? Like, for example, why are you prohibiting the sale of alcohol in supermarkets? Right? It's the more correct term for that. So my point was, like, to get back to the original point, is that the government is incentivized, the bureaucrats are incentivized to create prohibitions, because that creates work for them in various ways. And it gives them various friends. For example, if you're prohibiting something, this channels the money toward people who have licenses, right? So let's say if you prohibit the sale of alcohol in supermarkets, then this benefits people who have a license to sell alcohol in supermarkets, and then those people will then channel favors to the politician who maintains that system, right? But so the prohibitions and the inefficiency kind of go hand in hand. That's my point. To continue, they seek budget increases, expanded regulations, so expanded prohibitions, right, and greater authority over time to justify their existence and grow their influence, right? This was my point. This is sometimes referred to as bureaucratic self-interest or Parkinson's law. Since government bureaucracies are funded by taxpayers regardless of performance, there is no true market test to measure success or failure. And this is becoming, oh, sorry, let me just go back to that. So since government bureaucracies are funded by taxpayers regardless of performance, there is no true market test to measure success or failure. So this is becoming really obvious now with Doge. And this is why I think now libertarians really need to get activated, because we are getting a lot of energy behind our movement. And what Elon Musk is doing, what Javier Milei is doing, is really providing us with kind of marketing and promotional material, because both the socialists on the left and the socialists on the right now have to really work hard, because we can just get back and say, look, none of this makes sense. Whereas before it was like obvious, like their position was just, it was, the Overton window was on their side, and the Overton window is moving toward our side, to show that most of the government is just useless and waste of money, and the regulations are bullshit. Let me just make sure I do that. Okay. Public choice and cronyism. Austro-libertarians adopt insights from public choice theory developed by James Buchanan and Gordon Tillich, which applies economic reasoning to political decision-making. Politicians and bureaucrats often serve special interest groups rather than the general public, since small organized groups like corporate lobbyists, so basically, vulture capitalists, as well as unions and welfare recipients, have stronger incentives to lobby for policies that benefit them at the expense of dispersed taxpayers, right? So you have these two groups, right? Two different groups. One is the identifiable interest groups, and the other is just the taxpayers. It does this kind of a mass, right? This generalized mass that actually pay for everything. So the people who receive the benefits, they are identifiable groups that the politicians can appeal to, right? And get their votes from. Okay, whereas the people who pay for this stuff, they're not an identifiable group. This process, known as rent-seeking, leads to corporatism, subsidies, and protectionist policies that distort free market incentives. Okay, so it's just, it's hardwired into the system, the whole thing. Corporatism is just and cronyism and welfarism are hardwired into the mass democratic system. Five, incentives of state expansion. The state has a natural incentive to grow its power, as seen in the historical expansion of government agencies, taxation, and regulation. Crises like real or manufactured serve as a justification for greater state control. Wars, economic downturns, and pandemics often lead to emergency powers that are rarely rolled back. Robert Higgs's ratchet effect theory suggests that government intervention tends to grow during crises, but never fully retreats afterwards. So there's a crisis, right? The state pushes its power several steps forward, then there will be a bit of a pullback. But it will never be pullback all the way. And my problem with libertarianism is that these politicians, these libertarian politicians, they argue that they will pull back these powers, But when you look in detail, they never really, they can't, first of all, they can't do it practically because they're too small. So they can argue for that and gain votes, but there's no practical reality behind it. And secondly, even the stuff that they're promoting, you look at it and it's just setting the clock back like 1 year back, but everything that was all the regulations and prohibitions and taxes that expanded the government prior to that, they would just remain. In other words, they're only setting the clock back a little bit. They're not offering to set the clock back 100 years back to like the 19th century, which is really what libertarianism is. It's basically 19th century. The state is so small that it's irrelevant. Not last year, 100 years ago. That's what we need. Democracy as a form of soft exploitation. Austro-libertarians like Hans Hermann Hoppe argue that democracy, rather than restraining state power, actually incentivizes short-term plundering. Unlike monarchs who have a long-term interest in preserving their domain, elected officials operate under high-time preference. They extract as much wealth and distribute as many favors as possible before their term ends. So it's interesting because some of these libertarians, like here in Australia, in New South Wales, John Ruddick, he mentioned that he likes constitutional monarchy, but that's not really the Austro-libertarian position as articulated by Hans Hermann Hoppe, which is that it's actually absolute monarchy that incentivizes the monarch to not destroy the country. Because if you look at the UK and constitutional monarchy, right, the monarch doesn't really take the responsibility for bad decisions, okay? So let's say if Queen Elizabeth went to war in Iraq, she would be held responsible for that war. But instead, she delegated that responsibility to the parliament and to the prime minister, and his name will come back to me in a second, right? Tony Blair. So he bore responsibility for it, but he made a lot of rich friends. So he is held responsible, but he's not being held criminally responsible for that war. So he basically got off scot-free, whereas the monarch has nothing to do with it. And whereas if the monarch went to that war and then got the country into debt and flooded the country with foreigners, they would be held responsible. So you really don't want this constitutional monarchy. You don't want all this. You don't want this democracy because the responsibility is dispersed and the whole thing is legitimized through voting. Basically, you're legitimizing criminality and gangsterism through voting. That's what that's saying. You voted for it, right? So why state incentives lead to economic and social decline? Because state actors do not face competition or voluntary accountability. The incentives lead to wealth redistribution, inefficiency, and systemic corruption. Politicians and bureaucrats benefit by growing the state, while taxpayers and productive individuals bear the costs. The Austrian solution is to minimize or eliminate state power, relying instead on voluntary market-based institutions to provide goods and services efficiently. Okay, so what I want to look at is the spat on, you see, there's this idea that the options on the right, libertarianism and nationalism, that you could have like a channel from libertarianism to nationalism, that somehow they're compatible and continuous, when in reality they're radically incompatible. Because, but the appearance of compatibility is because libertarians are kind of conservatives, and they're kind of within the system, okay? When they're elected politicians, they still promote this electoral system, and they're conservative. So the elected libertarians, unless they're like really radical, like Ron Paul, although he, Ron Paul, let's say, he's radical. Elon Musk, unless they're like really ideological like that. If they are incrementalist, like I think the ones in Australia, either they're incrementalist or they are just fake. Okay, they're saying, well, I'm more libertarian than the establishment parties because look at what they did in COVID. I wouldn't do that, and I'm for free speech. None of that is libertarian. It's just traditional kind of conservatism, okay? Because the government should not have anything to do with speech. And if the government has the power to crack down on free speech, and you don't just advocate abolishing that power, you're just saying the government shouldn't use that power, but the government has that power. You see, libertarian position is you have to abolish the power to crack down on free speech, not to not use that power, which is what these fake libertarians are advocating. Well, if I were in power, I would not crack down on free speech. I would allow free speech. But you see, the thing is, you're allowing free speech. It means you don't have to allow it. You could disallow it. But you see, as long as you have the power to crack down on free speech, you can't be a libertarian. The goal of libertarianism needs to be to eliminate that power. So libertarianism is fundamentally, logically incompatible with any form of nationalism, because nationalism doesn't mean... See, nationalism, what it does, it says, look, you are an Australian or you're an Italian. Like, let's say you are in Italy and Mussolini is advocating for Italian nationalism, and it's saying, you're an Italian, and so the nation, right? Motherland. And you end up in the trenches, right, fighting for fascists who are basically dragging you out to the front. Like, you see in Ukraine, you're doing a shopping or in a nightclub, and they turn up and they drag you to the front line to die for the motherland or the fatherland. So you see, it starts out advocating for your nation, however defined, right? And then you end up dying in a ditch. Okay, so that's the nationalist kind of trick. They don't tell you, they're appealing to particular emotions, but you end up with a centralized tyrannical government, right? So somehow, because let's say I'm ethnically Polish, which I am, right? I'm Catholic, I speak Polish, that's my mother tongue, right? I still have Polish citizenship, and that's my ethnic background. And somehow, because of that, I'm supposed to agree and condone what the Polish state is doing. Okay? But there's a logical leap there, right? And it's purely emotional, okay? As far as I'm concerned, the Polish state is an egalitarian, socialistic, bureaucratic mass democracy, which is equalizing, because on top of being Polish, I identify as a bourgeois middle-class European, and so I'm outnumbered by the proletarians, by the working-class Poles. And I don't trust them. I think as an educated person, I feel that I know more, I'm better informed, and I'm against redistribution because I'm more economically mobile than they are. So they will be less informed, more emotional, and more incentivized to redistribute away from people like me toward them. So you have two different axes, right? You have the ethnic axis, and then you have the social class axis. So as far as the social class is concerned, I identify more with middle class, bourgeois, educated Europeans. Now, this idea of elite and bourgeois has been associated with the bureaucratic democratic systems and those people, but that's just that's propaganda, right? The traditional European bourgeoisie had, I mean, some of them were socialists and communists, right? But that wasn't the majority. The majority were highly conservative and religious, right? And created most of Western culture in the 19th century. So you see, the idea of nationalism, the nation state, is essentially a socialistic and egalitarian idea. It equalizes everyone within a particular ethnic group. Whereas prior to that, in the 19th century, people identified in terms of ethnicity, so language and religion, so Polish and Catholic, and social class, so educated European. You had these two elements to your identity, okay? And politicians, like let's say communists, they would appeal to the proletarian, and they would say, oh, you're a Polish working class person, and you're a German working class person, and so you should identify along those lines, right? Whereas the fascists would go, well, you're all Germans and you're working class, and you should identify in terms of class and ethnicity, in particular ethnicity, but also class, because they were socialists. National Socialists were socialists, which means they appealed to the working class. Okay, they were a workers' party, and this is just people just don't understand basic high school history. Okay, I lost my track. Where was I? So nationalists are socialists, they're egalitarians. You can't be an egalitarian and an anarcho-capitalist libertarian. Those are not compatible. Now, the ANCAPs and people like Elon Musk are identified with the technocracy, and I have to make another video explaining why that's complete. Like people like Nick Fuentes, you just keep hearing this, the technocracy, right? And that needs to be unpacked, because nationalists are using this as a kind of propaganda point against libertarianism. Well, Elon Musk is a technologist, like he's a tech entrepreneur, and therefore he's a technocrat, and that's completely wrong. Technocracy has been around for decades and has very little to do with technology. In fact, I would say it's anti-technology, as well as anti-capitalism. But that's a separate video. So let's have a look at this spat in the UK, in the Reform Party, among the nationalist people in the Reform Party. So I want to have a look at their policies before I look at Carl Benjamin's video. So Reform UK's platform is centered on national sovereignty, economic freedom, and opposition to excessive government intervention. So these are fairly libertarian policies, I would say. And that's understandable if you look at the background of the people in the party. So immigration controls, stronger border policies, reduced net migration, and stricter asylum rules. So why is this libertarian, right? So what is the libertarian position on immigration? As it's articulated by people like Hans Hermann Hoppe, the question is, who owns a country, right? So people tend to view libertarians as individualistic because of Ayn Rand. The way Ayn Rand articulated her ideas, they were very individualistic. Her positions were individualistic. But the individualistic part of her position is actually statist, because she was not an anarchist. She was a statist. She was a minarchist. So she believed that the state should protect individual rights. The problem is that that's not compatible with private property, because if you look at the question, can I refuse to bake the cake? You see, if the state protects individual rights, then it's kind of, it's not clear, it's vague on the issue. If I am a Christian baker and I refuse to bake the cake for an LGBT wedding, should the state protect the individual rights, like the lifestyle rights of the LGBT people, by forcing the baker to bake the cake? You see, that's kind of a test case for that position. And if not, then what is the protecting the individual part of the state? How does the state protect the individual rights if it doesn't force the Christian baker to bake the cake? And we have this discussion here in Australia, because a libertarian account from the Australian Capital Territory, which is the capital of Australia, for those who might not know that. Right? Canberra is the capital, and it's a fake city. And the libertarian account from that state told me on X that refusing to bake the cake is causing harm, and that's the Ayn Rand position. But it's not the anarcho-capitalist position. It's complete, because if it's my property, like let's say I have a house and I refuse, and someone comes in and say, I want to rent a room. And I say, well, I'm not going to rent a room to you because it's my house. The state can't force me to rent a room in my house because it's my house. It's up to me. Like, I can let people stay in that house, in my house or in my room, but it's my choice. Because it's my property. It's my property just means it's up to me what I do with this property. And if I have a cake shop, the moment that the state can tell me what I can do with it, then basically that's an infringement on my private property. You see, so the protecting of the individual rights by the state is different than protecting private property, right? It's not clear, and we have to maybe look at what Ayn Rand believes, how the state can protect individual rights other than protecting private property. And the ANCAP position is that as long as the state has a monopoly on power, which is what the conceptual definition of the state is, just monopoly on power, there is no true freedom, because the state decides, you see, the state decides what is the law, not just in the case of two competing parties who are a disagreement, right? Let's say someone wants to live in my house and I say no, and then I go to a judge to adjudicate. But the state also decides in its own case. And that just means that it's not an objective judge, right? It has a monopoly there. As long as the state has a right to adjudicate in conflicts that involve the state and other parties, that cannot, there's no, it cannot work. The incentives, this is just the wrong incentives, the system, it cannot work. Okay, so the Ayn Rand position, minarchist position, is not viable. You need a plurality where if an agency, we can call it the state, but let's say it's an agency is in conflict with another individual or group, then there has to be a third party that adjudicates between them. And as long as you have once you have that, you no longer have the state, because you no longer have monopoly on power. So the state is just an agency or a corporation, and it becomes a state when the moment that it adjudicates in conflicts, including itself. It might be a little bit difficult to get your head around it, but that's what it is. As soon as a state adjudicates in conflicts, including conflicts involving itself, right? Then that's the state. If you get rid of that and you have third parties adjudicating between that agency and the other agency or individuals, then it becomes a anarchy or no state position. Okay, so to continue. So migration. Okay, so to go back to the question of migration, right? Who owns the country? Who owns a particular piece of real estate or territory? And the ANCAP position is that there are two ways of acquiring. It's kind of first principle position. There's first principles of how you can acquire property without using violence, and that is either first use, or also known as homesteading, or voluntary exchange. Those are the only two legitimate, ethical, and voluntary ways of acquiring private property. So the question is, if people come, say, to a country like the UK, and it's already occupied and used by a population, right? The question is, do they have the right to just come in? And within the ANCAP philosophy, the idea is that the people who are already settled, they own that territory because they homesteaded it and built the infrastructure and built that country. And so there has to be some system of voluntary exchange, right? So let's say we don't really want a complete sealing off of the country. So we want some natural organic migration, right? And so that should be based on the people who occupy a territory, like a particular area in the UK, who are open to having people come in and work there, right? And then those people can be allowed to migrate. So you don't want complete zero migration, because the thing is, your people, like people in the UK, may want to migrate to other countries. So let's say I'm a Polish person and there's a job vacancy in the UK. An English person needs wants a Polish worker, right, or whatever. And then the British government, they elected ultra right-wing nationalists say, no, zero migration, we're not allowed. Well, the problem is that then if an English person wants to migrate to Poland, the Poland will reciprocate that, and they will say, no, we don't want any English people. So you want a system where it's reciprocal and both parties, it's just like you have free trade. You want relative migration so long as it's orderly and the people, property owners in one country are allowed to bring in people and vice versa. I think that was kind of like how Europe how it was done in Europe in the 19th century, right? Basically, there was organic movement of people, right, which was not funded or facilitated by governments the way it is now, or NGOs, right? This mass migration. It was just natural organic movement of people who had skills that were desirable in another location. Right? So people don't really want to move out of their country unless there is like economic incentives, right? And they can get a job in the other country and they feel that they can be well treated in the other country. And then there will be a natural process of assimilation. That's the libertarian position, right? Like Turks move to Germany, and a lot of Germans want to move to and retire in Turkey. And up to a certain point, that's a natural organic process. You have Turkish workers in Germany doing construction, and you have retired Germans retiring in Turkey, right, providing cash inflow into Turkey. And that's a natural match for those two countries to engage in that kind of exchange of people. And that has worked up to a point. But you don't want to close off countries from movement, because like a lot of foreigners want to retire in Thailand, right? From Europe, like people from Europe or the US, they want to retire in Thailand. So if Thailand decided zero immigration because of nationalism, that would be both bad for the foreigners who want to retire in Thailand and for the Thai economy, which does depend heavily on the money that those foreigners are bringing into the Thai economy. Okay, so, but you do want controls, right? Those foreigners who retire have to follow certain rules, there's a special retirement visa in Thailand, or work visas, right? You have to follow the rules. Okay. So far, the Reform Party seems like a reasonable, fairly libertarian party. Energy, so tax cuts and economic growth, lower taxes, particularly for businesses and workers, alongside deregulation to boost economic activity, sounds good to me. Now, I think it's not enough. I think they should go way further than that. I think they should go, like, try to eliminate taxes. But the problem is that the UK population is addicted to all this welfare. So it's very difficult to persuade. And you know, like you can hear how, for example, they talk about Thatcher and Thatcherism like it was a bad thing. As far as her policies to eliminate the welfare state, that's what they need to do. But they're addicted to it. So this is kind of like the reasonable common sense position. But the question is it actually doable without radical, like the kind of brain surgery, radical, open heart surgery that Javier Milei is doing to the Argentinian welfare state? Law and order, or energy independence, support for domestic energy production, including North Sea oil and gas, and opposition to net zero policies they see as harmful. Now, what does it mean, support, right? Does it mean subsidies? They should just liberalize the whole thing. Just let it rip. What does it mean, support? Like, why is the government supporting anything other than by just eliminating regulation, prohibitions? I don't understand why the state needs to support this stuff. That just sounds like statism, right? But anyway, you can read it in other way. If you read it in the sense of eliminating prohibitions, yeah. but they make it sound status, like they're gonna support it, like picking winners. Then if that doesn't work out, they're the ones to blame. Let liberalize it, and then if companies fail, that's their problem. But you support, well, that you're using taxpayer money to prop up failing industries. Why not just import cheap? Like, for example, it might be cheaper to import energy from Russia. Oh, but Russia is evil. Well, you see, that's the problem. It might be cheaper just to import gas from Gazprom in Russia, you know what I mean? I mean, you need the cheapest option, or some other country. So this doesn't sound too good to me. Law and order, tougher crime policies, increased police funding, and stricter sentences for violent offenders. Well, all of this should be privatized. NHS reform, greater efficiency in healthcare through decentralization, reducing bureaucracy. Well, you see, it's not saying privatize it. And the thing is, does that really work? Is it? You see, what we saw in terms of the incentives, it's kind of like, really? It's the incentive structure is all wrong. I mean, yeah, it sounds great, but really? I think libertarians should just look at that and go, nah. Unless you, as I said, unless you adopt the Javier Milei chainsaw approach, and you stake your political life on that, if it's like, well, we're gonna make it more efficient. It's by its very nature inefficient. You know, talking about making it more efficient sounds great, but without the chainsaw approach, only the market makes things efficient. You have to, but you're not educating your electorate about how, you're continuing this statist framing of everything, that somehow the state can make things more efficient. So you're just keeping your population in this mental prison of statism, where we're going to make it more efficient. BS. I call it BS. Freedom of speech and civil liberties, opposition to cancel culture, censorship, and what they see as excessive political correctness. So this is what I said earlier, that, but you're not removing the power of the state. So this is the same thing with central banking, right? So Javier Milei say he's going to abolish the central bank in Argentina, which has been printing money to fund all the welfare and creating hyperinflation. And he goes, I'm gonna abolish the central bank, but he's not abolishing it, and he found some BS reason for not doing it. And so the problem with that is that it's maintaining the power once he gets the Argentinian, he does the open heart surgery on Argentine economy, and then the Argentine economy gets reflated and back on track, and then this happened in Chile. What happened in Chile? What's his name? Pinochet, he brought in the Chicago boys. I think this was in the 70s. The Chilean economy became, the best economy basically in South America. And then they re-elected, they vilified him, re-elected communists, and the communists are now back in charge, trying to change the constitution to all this woke crap, and they're educating the teachers up, brainwashing into communism and Chile, and they're back to plundering, right? And so if you don't abolish the government, the state, the bureaucrats and the central banking, then the power is there to get back and get back into it again. So you see, unless you offer to abolish the power to censor, the power to censor is there. You're just saying, we're not going to censor. We can if you want to, but we're not going to. But you better vote for us. Well, no. I want you to abolish any possibility of censorship, because as long as the possibility of censorship is there, it's not libertarian. It's just it's faux libertarianism. All of this stuff that they're promoting is faux libertarianism. It's libertarianism, but it's fake, because it's just it's kind of it has the libertarian vibe to it. But when you look at it, all the power of the state and all the inefficiency of the bureaucracy is just basically curtailing and just saying, look, you've gone too far. You need to pull back on your inefficiency, right? It's not excising the whole thing, like just chopping bits off, like Elon Musk is doing, or Javier Milei. And I'm not saying that they're not chopping whole bits off. They're just not chopping enough of them. In particular, the central bank needs to be hacked, basically crushed and destroyed and delegitimized. The whole idea that, because what central banks do is they cause, central banking is the biggest joke. If anyone starts understanding what it is, it's basically a money printing operation. It's complex enough so that it takes a while to figure out what it is, which is money printing operation that causes the boom-bust cycle. But it's justified. It's justified on the basis that it will fix the boom-bust cycle. So it's saying that the boom-bust cycle is caused by the free market and that the central bank will fix it, when in reality, the central bank is what causes the boom-bust cycle. It's so perverted that once you understand it, your head explodes. But the politicians are, for some reason, incapable of getting rid of it. I'm getting overexcited. I forgot where I was. Let's continue. So freedom of speech and civil liberties, I call BS on that. Brexit completion, ensuring full independence from EU regulations and promoting trade deals outside the EU. That just sounds good. I mean, again, the EU went too far. They were too woke, right? And but you're just replacing one bad thing with another bad thing. And frankly, like I have an EU passport, right? I have an Australian passport and I have an EU passport. And just having that passport and knowing that I could potentially work and relocate to like one of the countries in the EU, in that Schengen zone, because it's become more libertarian. For example, Portugal is very good for, like, if you're in a crypto space, from a tax point of view, Portugal is very welcoming. I like that. So the EU is actually quite libertarian from that point of view. Even though it's interesting because Portugal, like when you're in Lisbon, in the center of Lisbon, you have all this communist signage, all this communist party. They have a communist party, like they have raving communists in Portugal in the politics, right? But from the point of view, if you're like a passport bro and you're a nomad and you are living off your laptop, Portugal is one of the go-to destinations. Because what they do is if you relocate there, they will give you like a tax-free deal. And so you see, so they got out of the EU and now they have all this mass migration, and it's actually getting worse. So before they had with the Polish plumber, and now they have millions of African boat people. And they're going to have other trade deals. Anyway, let's it's getting a little bit long. I'm sorry, my podcasts are quite long, but having said all of that, let's have a look at what Carl Benjamin, the future reform politician, says about the recent spat between Nigel Farage and what's his name? Lowe. Rupert Lowe. It's interesting that The Guardian, the British Pravda, thinks that Farage takes an unusual role of moderate voice. So they think that Rupert Lowe is this radical. So that's some points for Rupert Lowe, that the British Pravda believe that he's that's him there, that he's the radical. On the face of a decline. So yeah. So what happened? Well, let's listen to Carl Benjamin and let him explain the situation.
They say that a week is a long time in politics, and never has that been more true than right now. Over the past 5 days, things have gone kind of wild with the Reform Party in Britain, and a lot of scales have fallen from a lot of people's eyes, because it seems there's been a repeated pattern of really bad behaviour on the part of the leadership of the Reform Party. So for anyone who doesn't know, Rupert Lowe, the good Reform MP, or at least he was, came out and did an interview with the Daily Mail and just explained that, look, maybe the Reform Party needs to have something akin to a sort of hypothetical front bench. So there are spokespersons for each kind of thing that the government is expected to do, so Reform will look like a government in waiting, rather than looking like a party built around a messiah in Nigel Farage. And then things went south. Isabel Oakeshott, Richard Tice's girlfriend, decided to go on Talk TV and smirk about how naive Rupert was, thinking that he would dare be able to criticise Nigel Farage in public without any consequences. And my God, there's daggers in their smiles, isn't there?
Really sweet, isn't it? Poor little Rupert. He's quite new at politics. He's really new in the House of Commons. And, this is what happens to people who are amateurs at politics, and they become MPs and suddenly they think, yay, look at me, I think I could be Prime Minister. They all do it, bless him.
The next day, we found out that Rupert Lowe had been reported to the police by his own party on charges of bullying people in his office, Zia Youssef, and apparently some Labour MP. 3 months ago. Why the Labour MP had sat on it for 3 months is anyone's guess, but we can pretty much assume that the reason that Reform itself sat on these allegations for 3 months is because Elon Musk didn't think Nigel Farage was the guy who should be leading Reform, and in fact supported Rupert Lowe. And from that point onward, it seems that Rupert Lowe was a marked man. Then the smear machine began, but Rupert Lowe got ahead of all of this and said, look, there are people inside Reform who are briefing the press to let them know that I have early onset dementia, or that I have behavioural problems, that I attack people randomly or something. And Nigel Farage came out and said, yeah, no, well, it's been a real problem, and he's been really attacking everyone around us, and we've been trying to keep it from the public, but you know how it is. And that seemed like a massive crock of S. And then it turned out that the very allegations against Rupert Lowe themselves started evaporating into the air like total wind. It turns out that the bullying allegations were actually not against Rupert himself, but his office. So why are we suspending him? Why are we blaming him? And then Reform said, no, even if there turns out to be nothing, we're not having him back. So clearly this was just a politically motivated hit job and character assassination. And in response to this, people who have known Rupert Lowe for decades, including his own staff that were supposed to be the ones levelling the allegations against his office, came out and said, no, Rupert has done nothing wrong. He's a really good guy. He's a complete teddy bear. He's been a gentleman and has acted honourably with everyone around him, and we all like working for him. And suddenly you can see how this looks like a rake that the Farage party in Reform have stepped on, and it's smacked in their own face. Because suddenly people started coming out of the woodwork and saying, yeah, no, Nigel Farage did this to me too, and me, and me. And it turns out there's more than a dozen people that Nigel Farage has stepped on in his career to get further and further ahead without any kind of remorse. And so he's left a trail of broken political careers in his wake to get to where he is. And he thought he'd just be able to do the same thing again with Rupert Lowe.
In my case, I came in 2014. By 2016, people wanted me to take over as the new leader of UKIP. And only then were kind of the political dogs of war unleashed on me with false accusations I'd committed offences, false accusations that I was with various people despite being married. All of these were fed to the press to undermine me. And that led, unfortunately, to the massive row that occurred in the European Parliament, that led to the injuries, that led me to leave the party. But I wasn't the first. You see what he's using against Rupert Lowe at the moment.
But his problem is, Rupert Lowe is the person in Reform who is diligent, who is well-liked, who has done the hard work, who is telling the truth, and who, frankly, seems to be, honestly, and this was Dan's formulation, Boomer Jesus. Rupert Lowe gives his salary to charity. When the BBC went and investigated in Great Yarmouth, they found nothing but people saying glowing praise, saying, oh yeah, he's the one MP who's actually got something done for me around here. And so this seems like a really bad mistake, doesn't it?
Your political biography is strewn with roadside political corpses, people you've fallen out with?
I don't fall out with anybody. I just get on and do what I do. They fall out with me.
So after all of the people who came out and gave testimonials about Rupert came out in support of him, and then all of the people Nigel Farage has hurt over the years came out and gave their testimonials about their experiences with Nigel, it's not a surprise that you get posts like this from Leilani who say, oh, right, I was wrong about Nigel. I was wrong. I didn't understand why he was so difficult to deal with. I didn't understand why he kept throwing people I like under the bus. I didn't understand why he would never spend any amount of time with alternative media. He would never talk to any activists. He would never go outside of his very tightly knit circle of sycophants. And now you know. It turns out Nigel was not the man that we thought he was. And after this, Nigel did an interview with Channel 4, a little mini documentary, and man, did he say some strange things.
I'm not a populist.
I've heard you call yourself a populist.
I've realised I'm not. I've realised
This was last week you called yourself a populist.
I'm not a populist.
So yeah.
What separates great thinkers and the okay thinkers isn't talent. It's what they do with their time. And the great
Yeah, it seems that we were all wrong about Nigel Farage, and Nigel Farage seems to be the one telling us that we were all wrong. He's not the populist right-winger we thought that he was. He's not actually interested in helping the people of Britain. What it seems to be is that he's interested in creating a kind of political fief for himself, in which he is the absolute lord and sovereign, and everyone else can shut their mouths or get thrown under the bus. But alas, everyone says, if it wasn't for Nigel Farage, reform would be nowhere. And the thing is, Ben Habib rightly pointed out the other day, that's not true. It was because reform was doing well that Nigel came back. You might not remember, but in June last year, before Nigel Farage had rejoined, reform was up to 17% in the polls, because everyone hated Keir Starmer and his Labour Party, and they hated the Conservative Party, and they wanted a third option. And Richard Tice's reform was pretty much the only game in town at that point. And it was only when the polls came out of Clacton, showing it on about 35%, as in it was going to be a reform win for the candidate who was going to stand in Clacton, that Nigel Farage parachuted himself back in, took Clacton as the constituency he was going to run in, throw out under the bus whoever that guy was, I can't even remember, and I'm really sorry for that chap for not being able to remember your name off the top of my head, and installed himself because it was a guaranteed win. Nigel didn't do the canvassing in there. He didn't go down to Clacton and say, right, come on, guys, we can do this. He didn't flip that constituency. He parachuted himself in because he knew it was going to be successful, and it was. So when everyone says, oh, well, if it wasn't for us, they wouldn't have any MPs. No, it's the other way around. They were going to have MPs, which is why Farage was back, which is why Rupert Lowe won where he won as well. That's not the Farage effect. That's the we hate the main parties and we want an alternative effect. And so when people say, well, reform is just the Nigel Farage party, well, have you asked reform members about that? Because they don't think so. There was a YouGov poll that came out today that showed that actually only about 1/3 of reform voters and members are actually Nigel Farage diehards. Another third don't think it really makes that much of a difference who's in charge of the party. And another third think the party would be doing even better if they didn't have Nigel Farage as the leader. And to be honest with you, they might be right. Why hasn't reform cracked more than 25% in the polls on average now? It's actually hard to say, considering how unpopular Labour and the Conservatives are. It could be that Farage himself is acting as a hard cap, not only due to the fact that, okay, only one man's personal brand can only go so far, but his absolute refusal to build a coalition and bring in those other people in the same way that Trump brought in RFK, Tulsi, Kash Patel and others, to bring in people who wouldn't naturally be with Trump, but because that guy is with him and we like that guy, we're going over to him. Reform could be much higher if Nigel Farage was actually able to build a coalition, and it might be he's the thing that's holding it back. And it's important to note as well that 90% of Reform members did not want Rupert Lowe kicked out. This is not a popular decision, and you can see by just looking at any of their Twitter feeds at the moment. They are, as far as they're concerned, battening down the hatches and trying to weather the storm. But people are really pissed off about this. This seems to have actually kicked off a proper firestorm, and so now Nigel Farage is out in the media trying to defend himself, saying, well, I didn't want this. This wasn't something I was looking for. It's like, okay, but why did you make it happen? You're the ones who made this happen. You sat on the allegations until it was convenient to then try and, bam, shoot Rupert Lowe out behind the shed. But it turns out that actually his record was actually completely unblemished. There was nothing that you could do character-wise to destroy him, which is the worst, meanest girl type of way of dealing with something. If you just said, look, we just don't want you here, get out, that would have at least been more understandable. But being a total bitch about it, come on, man. But then that didn't work. And so now you say, oh, well, I just want to get past it. I just want to move on. This is a distraction that I don't need. Well, you created this for yourself. You did this. No one else did this to you. And so now we're in a position where Rupert Lowe is going to fight this to the bitter end because it's his name. It's his good name that's on the line. He's done nothing wrong. You thought you could just steamroll him like you did everyone else in the past. But actually, it turns out that Rupert Lowe is already an MP, so you can't change that. Doesn't need your money, so you've got no way of controlling him. And actually wants to do the right thing. Not just by himself or by others, but by the country. And so now you have created a man who...
Well, he says that he wants to do the right thing. That's what he says, because he's a politician, right? so if you look at their background, Rupert Lowe has a background in finance, and he invested in some retirement homes, and and then Nigel Farage also has a background in finance, and Nigel Farage made his name as part of UKIP in the European Parliament, and then was instrumental in bringing about the Brexit vote. And this guy, Rupert Lowe, started saying that it shouldn't be just about Nigel Farage. So it's a dick measuring contest. Basically, Rupert Lowe, well, he did nothing wrong. Well, he challenged the king, right? He challenged the king. And so the king decided to teach him a lesson, get rid of him. It's all politics. And neither side is the saint, because it's all about power. You play as the saint because that's how you get votes, right? There's Rupert Lowe. He decided that Nigel Farage is pushing his weight around whereas the party was doing fine without him. And so they decided to see, it was a dick measuring contest. I mean, it's just a power play on both sides. And from a libertarian point of view, you can't believe any of it, and somehow because they're populists, they're just these parties, these nationalist parties, they will make libertarian noises, but basically they're exploiting particular sentiments, like there's a population that feels disenfranchised and is not dependent on labor, welfare benefits, NHS, all this stuff, or on the Tory, whatever, rent-seeking. They're not rent-seeking Tory favors. So then reform comes in and is going to exploit those sentiments, and then they're going to make some libertarian noises, and then who is the villain, who is the saint? This is endless. The problem is that as long as you have this mass democracy, this stuff is never ending, and there will always be a new party that will solve the problem. You know what will solve the problem? The free market, the effing free market. Privatize everything. And the problem, within the system, even the libertarians, like here in New South Wales, we have this Libertarian Party. I don't trust them because they have to buy votes. And the question is, who is behind them? Who is rent-seeking? Okay? The assumption is there's rent-seeking behind every party. Either they are just BSing, throwing out the slogans, but when you scratch beneath the surface, there's nothing behind it. It's just, a small rollback of the bureaucratic tyranny, or there is rent-seeking behind the party. There's people with money who will, typically on the right, it's going to be vulture capitalists of some form. All these market liberalizations. What's happened with universities when they privatized? They're just starting selling degrees. But when you look, does that mean that there's competition in the market? No, there isn't. These universities have a monopoly on that market, and now they're gonna sell the degrees to foreigners, and it just becomes another channel of migration and devaluing the whole education system. These degrees are meaningless. They're basically just devalued pieces of paper, right? So much for market liberalization of the education system. All BS, right? It's all a scam. It's all vulture capitalism, which gives libertarianism a bad name. So neither option within the current system. This is my basic point of my article. Within the current system of the mass democracy, it's both options are just libertarian, libertarian, faux libertarian, pseudo-libertarian. As long as they are, unless they're hacking off whole parts of the, like radically decentralizing and hacking off whole parts of the bureaucratic machinery, and they're just talking about free speech, well, that's a no-brainer. I mean, it's a very low-hanging fruit. You know what's not a low-hanging fruit? The Reserve Bank of Australia, right? Do that, promote that, and then I will, not some incrementalism. Okay, thanks for listening, and talk to you next time.